Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Counseling Families. Today, we're going to be exploring a little bit of what we call narrative family therapy, which is an approach that invites us to explore the powerful role that stories play in shaping the identities of both you as an individual as well as your family. Now, before diving into the content, I want us to take a moment and think about our own lives. Each of us has stories that we tell ourselves, stories that others have told about us, and even stories that society has shaped for us. And these narratives can define who we are and who we think we can be. And sometimes they empower us, and other times they limit us. So, can you think of a story, either from your own life or someone else's, that changed the way you or they saw themselves? I want you to just think about that for a little while. How did that story influence their behavior or your behavior or their relationships or your relationships or their sense of identity? And has there been a time in your life when you felt trapped by a story that others were telling about you? This all goes to show just how powerful stories are. So, within this lecture, we will start off with telling you a little story about someone that knew about stories and how stories impact the family. Then we'll dive into the three main themes of this lecture. First off, the idea that narrative therapy operates on the foundational beliefs that stories shape how individuals and families understand themselves. And this theme will explore how there are dominant narratives, often problem-saturated, that can limit a family's ability to alter their perspectives. And we'll discuss how these stories can influence identity and behavior and relationships within the family, as well as how narrative therapy seeks to reauthor those stories to open up new possibilities for growth and healing. Then we'll look at the role of the therapist as a collaborator, where the therapist in narrative family therapy does not take the traditional expert role, but instead really collaborates with the family, fostering an environment of curiosity and openness and mutual respect. And this theme will examine how the therapists help family members to externalize problems, separate themselves from limiting narratives, and explore new stories that better reflect their values and strengths. And then finally, we will delve into the specific techniques used in narrative family therapy, such as externalizing conversations, reauthoring, and identifying unique outcomes, where the family can and has demonstrated strengths and resilience. And so these techniques are designed to help families rewrite their shared narratives, offering them the opportunity to see new ways forward. Now, let's start off with our little story about narrative family therapy, and we're going to look at today a fellow by the name of Michael White, who was a central figure in the development of narrative therapy and is often regarded as one of the most influential therapists in the field of postmodern family therapy. Michael White was born in Adelaide, South Australia in 1948, and White really originally trained as a social worker, but he was dissatisfied with the traditional approaches to therapy. And this really led him to explore more innovative and collaborative techniques. And his curiosity and passion for understanding the human experience and the stories people tell about their lives became really foundational for his groundbreaking work within the field. Now, Michael White did not work in isolation. He worked alongside his co-founder, David Epstein, and together they really kind of founded narrative therapy in the 1980s. And White's key concept was that the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. And this was revolutionary at the time. There isn't a person that's a problem within the family. There's a problem that is the problem within the family. And so he started to externalize problems. And this started to enable clients to separate their identities from the issues they faced. And this concept allowed individuals and families to see themselves not as defined by their problems, but as having the potential to take control of their lives by rewriting their stories. Now, White also developed the practice of reauthoring conversations, a technique that encourages clients to develop alternative stories about themselves, thickening those narratives by highlighting their strengths and their values and their unique outcomes. And there are moments when they were not dominated by these problems. And he is also known for his use of what we call therapeutic documents, such as letters written to clients, summarizing their sessions, affirming their progress, and reinforcing the new narrative they are building. And so Michael White has really left a legacy on the field of counseling families. His work really fundamentally reshaped how therapists view their role in the therapeutic process, no longer as experts imposing solutions, but really as collaborators, helping clients and families discover their own paths. And so his collaborative approach has been widely adopted in various fields, including counseling and social work and education. Now, as you might see there, Michael White passed away in 2008, but his legacy continues. His ideas and methods continue to impact people. So, let's take a little bit of time now and look at narrative therapy. We can really kind of think about narrative therapy as what we used to call a postmodern approach to therapy that really kind of challenges some of the more traditional models of diagnosing and then treating clients based upon predetermined frameworks. Instead, narrative therapy really views individuals and families as being shaped by stories. The stories they tell about themselves, the stories they tell about the world around them, about other people. And so narrative therapy places emphasis on how these narratives influence identity and behavior and relationships, offering a way to externalize problems and explore alternative stories. And I hope you see in there just how powerful this approach can be, particularly in a place here like Sisitan Wapitan Oyate, where stories are so rich and where stories can sometimes perpetuate a problem, but where stories can be changed, where people can isolate themselves and externalize the problem, like addiction, from themselves and begin to change their stories. Narrative therapy believes that individuals and families have multiple, often competing narratives about themselves, their lives, and their problems. And these narratives can either empower or limit them. So by reauthoring these stories, families can open up new possibilities for connection, for healing, and transformation. So the key concept, and you might hear me repeat this over and over again, but it's because this is important. And this is kind of important in any kind of counseling, but particularly in family therapy. And that is the idea that the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. Say it with me. The person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. Now, one of the key principles of narrative therapy is this whole idea of externalization, of separating the problem from the person. And this allows people to view their issues as external forces rather than internal failures. So a person doesn't have to beat themselves up in order to be in therapy. For example, instead of seeing a family member as an angry person, they might externalize the problem and view anger as something that affects them, allowing them to work on reducing its impact. And when you have this reframing, it really encourages families to understand that the problem is not inherent to who they are. Rather, it is something that can be addressed and managed. By externalizing problems, narrative therapy fosters a sense of empowerment, allowing families to see themselves as capable of changing their circumstances. Now, when we're working with narrative therapy as this postmodern approach, we need to kind of remember that the role of stories play in shaping a family's identity and an individual's experience. Families are made up, really, of complex and interconnected stories, and they're passed down through generations, or they're created through shared experiences. And these stories shape how family members view themselves and their roles within the family. So, oftentimes families get stuck in problem-saturated narratives. Oftentimes communities get stuck in problem-saturated narratives. Oftentimes whole cultures get stuck in problem-saturated narratives. And it's our role to somehow change that. Where negative stories dominate their interactions, limiting their ability to see alternative possibilities. So I hope you see there that oftentimes people limit themselves by the stories they live within. Narrative therapy seeks to challenge these dominant narratives and help families explore other alternative stories that might better reflect their strengths and their values and their unique experiences. And then by thickening these alternative stories, families can create new ways of understanding themselves and their relationships, which opens the door to positive change. Now, a little bit of a review then of narrative therapy and its history. It started in the 1980s with Michael White and David Epstein. They were Michael White from Australia, David Epstein from New Zealand, and they worked collaboratively to challenge traditional ideas and to try to bring forward the idea that we create our own reality. That's that whole postmodern philosophy, particularly the idea that there are really multiple truths in the world and that reality is constructed through language and stories and culture. And so this philosophical underpinning really informs their therapeutic approach, where the goal is not to fix the client, but to help them to find new ways of understanding and living their lives through their stories. And this really does then become a very powerful human way of doing therapy. So one of the key concepts of narrative family therapy is the idea of understanding the dominant problem-saturated narrative versus alternative narrative. So I want you to think about your own life. What are the dominant stories that you live within? Are they even true? How can you change those? And as you do, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use these stories, because this key concept of narrative family therapy is the idea of dominant narratives versus alternative narratives. Dominant narratives are those stories that tend to control how individuals and families view themselves. They're often very problem-saturated, and this reinforces negative perceptions and behaviors. So, for example, a family may have a dominant narrative that revolves around failure, conflict, or dysfunction, making it difficult to see any other perspective. And alternative narratives, on the other hand, are stories that offer a different, more empowering view of the family or individual. And these stories highlight strengths and resilience and positive experiences that are often overlooked. And narrative therapists help families discover and thicken these alternative narratives, allowing them to reframe their views of themselves and their relationships. Now, one of the most powerful techniques in narrative therapy is the idea of externalization of the problem. And this really involves separating the problem from the person. Instead of viewing a family member as the problem, like he's an addict, or she was always anxious, or he was always angry, the family is encouraged to see the problem as something external, and this affects the family. So addiction affects him, or anxiety is impacting her life. And this allows the family to approach the issue collaboratively, without there being blame, without there being shame, without blaming or beating up on anybody. And then we can work together to address this. So externalization is really critical in narrative family therapy, because it creates a space where the family can discuss problems more openly and constructively. It reduces defensiveness and helps family members focus on solutions rather than getting stuck in negative cycles of blame. And then there's the idea of thickening alternative stories to create new possibilities for the family. And when we talk about thickening here, we're really referring to the process of adding depth and richness and truthfulness and walking these alternative stories into the real world to make them concrete. And once a family has begun to identify an alternative story, one that is more hopeful and reflects their strengths, the therapist helps them to expand this story. The goal here is to move from a thin narrative, a brief, underdeveloped story, to a thicker narrative, which includes more detail and a greater sense of agency and possibility. So, for example, if a family begins to recognize moments of connection, despite a history of conflict, the therapist might encourage them to explore those moments in more detail. What were they doing differently during those times? How did those moments reflect their values or their strengths? And so by thickening these alternative stories, families can start to see new possibilities for how they relate to one another. Another key concept is the whole idea of deconstructing the problem-saturated narrative that I've talked about. Because narrative therapy is deconstructing the problem-saturated narrative that dominates the family story. And deconstruction here really involves questioning the assumptions of the dominant story, the beliefs of the story, and the societal influences that contribute to these negative stories. And often families are trapped in problem-saturated narratives that feel inevitable or unchangeable, but these narratives are usually shaped by external factors such as societal expectations, cultural norms, or past trauma. And by helping families deconstruct their narratives, the therapist empowers them to see that the story they are living in is not the only possible story. They can begin to challenge the negative assumptions they've held about themselves and start to explore new ways of being. And this process helps individuals to recognize the larger influence of larger systems such as societal pressures and how these forces shape family dynamics. So, what's the role of the therapist in family therapy? Well, we can really think about the therapist's role it's fundamentally different than from traditional view of therapists as being the expert who diagnoses and then prescribes a solution. Instead, the therapist is seen as a collaborator where they work alongside the family to help them explore their stories and discover new possibilities. And so this approach emphasizes the idea that families are the true experts of their own lives, and the therapist's role is to help them to really just to uncover and reshape their narratives. So the therapist does not impose interpretations or solutions, but instead asks questions that encourage the family to reflect on their experiences in new ways. And by taking this collaborative stance, the therapist fosters a sense of agency within the family, empowering them to take ownership of their problems and their solutions. So a central quality of the therapist in narrative family therapy is the idea of curiosity. So rather than making assumptions and jumping to conclusions, the therapist remains genuinely curious about the family stories. Where do these stories come from? What's the nature of these stories? Who are the key players in these stories? And so the therapist is asking open questions that invite the family to explore different aspects of their narrative, uncovering what are the hidden meanings behind this story? What are the alternative interpretations of this? And so this openness helps create a safe space for family members to feel heard and to be validated, which is really essential in this whole process of reauthoring their stories. Someone's not going to engage if they're feeling judged all the time. So many families come to therapy with really established power dynamics where certain voices dominate while others may be marginalized or silenced. And a key task of the narrative therapist is to help to deconstruct some of these power dynamics as well by ensuring that all family members have an opportunity to share their perspectives. And this often involves challenging the dominant narratives that reinforce certain roles or behaviors within the family and giving space to alternative stories to emerge. So, for example, if a family where one parent's voice typically overrides others, the therapist might work to ensure that the voices of the children or the other parents are heard and valued. And by shifting the power dynamics, the therapist helps the family create a more balanced and collaborative way of interacting. And narrative therapists place a strong emphasis upon using respectful and non-blaming language in their work with families. And this aligns with the principle of externalizing problems. By avoiding language that blames or labels individuals, the therapist helps the family see problems as separate from the people involved. And this encourages a more constructive and compassionate approach to resolving conflicts or addressing challenges. So, for instance, instead of saying, "You're being very controlling," a therapist might say, "It seems like control is influencing the way you interact with your family." And see, that little subtle shift in language helps to reduce defensiveness and allows for a more productive discussion about the problem at hand. So when you externalize and have externalizing conversations, you're separating the problem from the person. And that's the whole cornerstone of externalization, where the therapist helped the family to separate the problem from the person or the family system. And so we do this by externalizing conversations, where the therapist encourages family members to discuss the problem as an external entity, maybe as a creature that is just around and is impacting on people. And that influences their lives rather than seeing it as a part of who they are. So, for example, instead of saying, "I am anxious," a family member might say, "Anxiety is something that is affecting me right now." Or, "Anxiety is sitting on my shoulder, whispering in my ear." And this subtle shift is a powerful shift because it reduces blame and it reduces guilt, and it allows family members to start to collaborate and address the issue. Otherwise, you just get stuck in blame and defensiveness all the time. And as soon as there's defensiveness in therapy, things get shut down. There isn't going to be any change. So externalizing conversations often give an opportunity for the problem to be named or identified by allowing the family member to distance themselves from the problem. Then there is something that we call the reauthoring conversations, where we explore and develop new stories. So in reauthoring conversations, the therapist helps the family to explore alternative stories that highlight their strengths and values and abilities to overcome dominant, problem-saturated narratives. So the therapist helps the family to reauthor their story by expanding their alternative narratives and integrating them into the family's identity. So reauthoring might involve asking questions like, "Can you tell me about a time when you handled this situation differently?" Or, "What does this say about what your family values?" And through this process, families can begin to see themselves not as victims of their problems, but as agents capable of making positive changes. And then we can pull in some unique outcomes, moments when the problem does not dominate the family story. And this helps the family to separate themselves from the problem. Because unique outcomes are moments when the family has acted in ways that do not fit the dominant problem narrative. And these moments provide opportunities for the therapist to highlight the family's capabilities and to start building an alternative narrative. For example, in a family dealing with conflict, a unique outcome might be a moment of peace or cooperation that contradicts the belief that the family is always in conflict. And the therapist helps the family identify and build on these unique outcomes by asking questions such as, what was different about that time? Or how were you able to do that? And these conversations allow the family to reflect on their strengths and to develop new ways of relating to one another. And we can do this by incorporating the use of letters and documents. These are therapeutic conversations that reinforce the new stories that are being developed within the therapy. So after a session, a therapist might write a letter to the family summarizing what they discussed. They might highlight key moments of progress and emphasizing the family's strengths. And these letters begin to serve as a tangible reminder of the family's journey and can be referred back to as a source of encouragement. And in addition to letters, the therapist might create therapeutic documents such as a certificate of achievement or declarations of new identities, which symbolize the family's progress in reauthoring their story. And these documents can be powerful tools in helping families solidify their new narratives and build a sense of accomplishment. And so therapists may also use therapeutic conversations where family members are encouraged to engage in dialogues that reinforce the alternative stories they are creating. And these conversations can take place in session or outside of therapy. And these all help the family to continue reflecting on and developing their new narrative. Now, one of the key aspects of narrative therapy is its really inclusion and inclusive approach, which seeks to really involve all family members. And so the therapist encourages each family member to share their vision of the family story, and this ensures that everybody's heard. And this is especially important where certain members may feel marginalized or overlooked. So to facilitate this, the therapist might ask open-ended questions that invite each family member to reflect on their experiences and their perspectives. Questions like, how do you see this problem affecting the family? Or, what role do you feel you played in this story? And this all really helps to bring out different viewpoints and ensure that the storytelling process is collaborative and that it's well balanced. We want this to be fair. And by engaging the whole family, this allows for the identification of multiple narratives, some of which it may have been silenced or minimized over time. And by bringing these stories to the forefront, the therapist can help the family understand their dynamics in a more nuanced way and begin the process of reauthoring their shared narrative. So in narrative family therapy, listening to is a critical tool. The therapist models active, empathetic listening to ensure that all stories within the family are heard. Often, families become entrenched in dominant narratives that overshadow alternative stories, especially those that might challenge the status quo or involve painful memories. And the therapist listens for hidden or silent stories, those that may not fit the dominant narrative, but hold the key to reauthoring the family's identity. And these stories might involve moments of resilience and strength or positive change that have been overlooked. And so by listening attentively, the therapist can help the family uncover these stories and begin to integrate themselves into their new narratives. Another key thing with narrative family therapy is its really strong emphasis on helping the family to identify their inherent strengths and values. And these qualities are often embedded in the alternative stories that the family may not have fully recognized or celebrated. And the therapist works with the family to explore these stories and highlight moments of resilience and unity or love that may have been overshadowed by the problem-saturated narrative. And so techniques such as strengths-based questioning help families reflect on their values and what they stand for as a unit. And questions like, what does your family value most? Or can you think of a time when your family came together in a way that reflects those values? And that guides the family toward a deeper understanding of their identity beyond their problems. So, as the family identifies their strengths and values, the therapist helps them weave these elements into their new narrative, thickening the alternative story and creating a more complete and empowering picture of their family's identity. And so this process not only helps the family move past the problem-saturated narrative, but also strengthens their bonds by focusing on what they do well together. So there are a lot of flexibility within narrative family therapy. It's not something that's really structured. It is structured, but it's flexible. And this really kind of allows for the whole process of reauthoring their stories. So the therapist, essentially, I'll just kind of walk through some of the steps in family therapy because it's really quite simple when you get the hang of it, and yet extremely powerful. And it moves this client through stages of change, which are really beneficial. And that's one of the reasons why I really like narrative family therapy. So we can kind of start off with stage one when we're working with a family. And that is really to identify the dominant problem narrative. So the first step in narrative family therapy, of course, you're trying to create therapeutic rapport, and all of that is important. But as you move into the therapeutic side of things, you're looking to identify the dominant narrative that has been shaping the family's identity and interactions. And this narrative is often very problem-saturated and reflects the struggles or difficulties the family's been facing, like addiction. The family begins by listening to the family story, asking open-ended questions such as, how do you see this problem affecting your family? Or, what story do you tell yourselves about the situation? And in this stage, the family begins to recognize the narrative that has been guiding their thoughts and behaviors. And the therapist helps the family externalize the problem by separating it from individual family members and setting the foundation for future work. Then we move into stage two, which is once you have the dominant narrative has been identified, the therapist begins working with the family to externalize the problem. Remember, the person isn't the problem is the problem. And this involves giving the problem a name or identity. I like to get families to just use a simple name, like Bob. Bob the Blob. So you can kind of visualize something as a conflict monster, and he's just a blob that sits in the corner. And this allows the family to see it as something separate from themselves. Oh, Bob the Blob is here. And this externalizes the problem and enables family members to talk about it without blaming or labeling one another. So, for example, if the family struggling with conflict, they might name the problem the conflict monster. And this gives the family a way to talk about the issue collaboratively as something that they can work together to manage or reduce. And the therapist might ask something like, how has the conflict monster been affecting your family? And to encourage reflection or exploration. Then we take stage three, which is deconstructing the problem-saturated narrative. So after externalizing the problem, the therapist begins to help the family deconstruct the problem-saturated narrative. And this involves questioning the assumptions and beliefs that have been sustaining the dominant narrative. The therapist asks reflective questions to challenge the family's perception of the problem, such as, why do you think this problem has been so powerful in your lives? Or are there times when the problem was less dominant? And so this stage helps the family to see that their problem-saturated narrative is not the only possible story, that other, more empowering narratives can emerge. The next stage in this process is identifying unique outcomes. So, as the family deconstructs the problem-saturated narrative, the therapist helps them identify unique outcomes. And by the way, if you're kind of thinking in very simplistic terms, you can think about every session, every week is a new stage that you're kind of focusing on. And that gives you a nice, easy path for working with a family. So in this week, we're looking at unique outcomes. That gives you a nice, easy guide as a therapist to working with your family through these problems. So unique outcomes are moments when the family has acted in ways that contradict the dominant narrative. And so these are moments of success, of resilience, or positive change that may have been overlooked or minimized. So, for example, the family might recall a time when they worked together harmoniously, even though the dominant narrative suggests constant conflict. And so the therapist highlights these unique outcomes and encourages the family to explore them further with asking questions like, what was different about that time? Or how did you manage to work together so well in that particular situation? Then we come to the next stage, which is reauthoring. And in the reauthoring stage, the family begins to construct a new narrative that reflects their strengths, their values, and their unique outcomes. You can kind of think about this as being a new book in the story of their life. And this new story challenges the problem-saturated narrative and opens up new possibilities for how the family can relate to one another. And the therapist facilitates this process by asking questions that help the family develop their alternative story, such as, what kind of family do you want to be? Or how do your strengths help you overcome challenges? And so reauthoring involves expanding on the family's unique outcomes and thickening the new narrative by exploring what it says about their identity and values. And then finally, stage 6 is solidifying this new narrative. We kind of think of this, you can kind of think of this as being the final stage in narrative family therapy, where you're solidifying the new narrative, and you do this by various techniques, and this can take several sessions. Like have clients read the therapeutic letters that the therapist had sent and reflecting upon them, or creating documents that affirm the family's progress, or engaging in rituals that symbolize this transition to a new way of being. And these tools really serve as tangible reminders of the family's growth and help them hold on to their new narrative in the long term. And so therapists may ask the family to reflect on how their new narrative can guide their future actions. And they might use questions like, how do you continue to live out this new story in your daily life? So it's about creating and reinforcing the family's agency and their ability to shape their own story going forward. And this is incredibly powerful. Now, let's take a look at how we might be able to use this in an issue of addiction, or alcoholism in this case. So, in families where alcoholism is present, the dominant narrative often revolves around themes of failure and shame and guilt and hopelessness. And family members may view the person struggling with alcohol as the person that is the problem. And the family identity has become deeply entangled in this whole cycle of addiction. And this problem-saturated narrative often limits the family's ability to see alternative perspectives or to recognize moments of strength and resilience. So in narrative therapy, the first step with families struggling with alcoholism is to externalize the problem of alcohol use. So rather than labeling a family member as an alcoholic or the problem, alcohol itself is identified as an external force impacting the family. And you see that allows the family to unite against the problem rather than turning against each other. So a common technique used by families dealing with alcoholism is to externalize alcohol by naming it, let's call it the alcohol monster. And then encouraging the family to discuss how this monster has affected their lives. It lives in the corners. We need to clean it out of the house. And by externalizing alcohol, the family can then work together to identify its influence without blaming the individual who's struggling with its use. So, for example, the therapist might ask, how has the alcohol monster been affecting your family's relationships? Or what does the alcohol monster do that prevents your family from working together? And these questions shift the focus from personal blame to collaboration, allowing the family to start creating strategies for managing and overcoming the problem. And so you would go through the process of identifying unique outcomes and alternative stories of alcohol-affected families. And then, of course, you would go through the process of reauthoring the family's narrative around alcohol use, and then support recovery through solidifying that narrative. The same thing that can be done with drug use. When you externalize the problem, so that you have this drug beast that sometimes lives in the house and kind of jumps on people, you can identify how a person and the family functions when that drug beast is not around, and how it impacts on people when the drug beast is around. And then you can help the family to reauthor the family narrative in the context of this story. So how can we have a healthier future? What will that future look like when we are able to put that drug beast in the cage? And then we can have letters and documents and rituals to solidify that new narrative of how we live without the drug beast. And all of this, so you see, is done without blaming anyone. It's something that helps you to work in a way where we're not shaming, we're not making people feel guilty, we're not causing defensiveness. Now, there are some challenges with narrative therapy. Sometimes it can be very abstract in nature. The whole concept of externalization and reauthoring and deconstructing dominant narratives can be difficult for some families to grasp. Some families prefer more concrete and directive forms of therapy, and that's why in this class we teach multiple ways of doing family therapy, because this may not be something that works all the time. So you want to have other types and approaches in family therapy to decide what works for a family and what might not work for a family. So there can also be resistance to reauthoring stories. Sometimes the story is so entrenched that people don't want to give it up. And so sometimes you need a lot of patience and empathy in order to kind of work through this process. And sometimes people want to hold on to stories because they view them as cultural or societal, and they don't want to give them up, or they don't want to change them. And so you need to recognize that sometimes you need to kind of work around that and use other approaches. But for the most part, family therapy is powerful because we do live in these constructed worlds of culture and society and values. And so when we recognize that the problem is the problem, not the person is the problem, then we are really on a good trajectory towards healing within the family. So just kind of close out with a few key terms and concepts here. First key term within narrative family therapy is the whole idea of externalization, that key technique in narrative therapy where the problem is separated from the person. Instead of viewing the individual or family as inherently flawed or troubled, the problem is seen as an external force that affects them. Instead of saying, I am anxious, a person might say, anxiety is trying to control me. I hope you see the difference. Then the idea of reauthoring, the idea that we are not victims of a story, we actually have a role to play within the story, and that is our reauthoring process, which is something that we can teach our clients and our families. And the process of helping individuals and families develop and tell new stories about their lives and emphasizing their strengths and values and moments of success rather than being stuck in problem-saturated narratives can be very powerful. A family previously defined by conflict might reauthor their story by focusing on times when they worked together harmoniously, building a new narrative of cooperation. And then the idea of unique outcomes, because there are moments when a person or a family acted in ways that contradict the dominant problem-saturated narrative. And these are instances of success or resilience that provide a foundation for building an alternative story. So, for example, if a family believes they are always in conflict, a unique outcome might be a time when they had a peaceful and enjoyable dinner together. So, as far as our quiz goes, which of the following is a technique in narrative therapy that involves separating the problem from the person? Well, when you separate the problem from the person, that is the technique of externalization, where instead of viewing the individual or family as inherently flawed or troubled, the problem is seen as an external force that affects them. So, I hope that you see the value of narrative family therapy. So as we close out, I want you to just kind of reflect a little bit on your own story. Can you think of a narrative about yourself or your family that has shaped your identity in a significant way? And how has this story influenced your actions or relationships? And I hope you see that it has. Then I want you to consider your role as a therapist. As you move forward in your career, how do you think the concept of and the concepts of externalization and reauthoring and identifying unique outcomes might be useful in your work, particularly when you work with families? How will you incorporate a collaborative approach to help families reauthor their stories? Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.